rapid fire run through of my Digital Construction Week 2023 presentation because it's nice to be able to remember the things you said, right? As ever, what I've done is given myself a ridiculous title and then kind of tried to work back from there. So this year's title is Data and the Built Environment, a Meta-Narrative. Spoiler alert, we may never quite get to the meta-narrative. But there's something, it's worth pausing, I think, and reflecting on where we are. You know, we are in the midst of multiple simultaneous interrelated crises, climate emergency, rampant inequality, widespread disinformation. And perhaps the thesis of this presentation is that the built environment has a massive role to play in these, particularly the first two. And as data professionals working in the built environment, we should aspire to be part of the solution rather than just an expensive distraction. It's not always clear what side of that distinction we're on. So I've been writing a book on that topic with my acquaintance, Professor Neil Thompson, and walking through St James's Park near the start of our writing period. He kind of summed it up really nicely, which is people have been doing digital to the built environment for decades now. Has it actually made the outcomes of the sector any better? And the book is something of an appraisal of that, starting from the 20,000-foot view, and I'm working all the way down into specific applications and types of data infrastructure. Part of the writing process has been becoming comfortable with having ideas. I posted an article back about how whenever the built environment sector faces a problem, it's very good at coming up with job titles that reflect that problem. The one that always comes to mind for me is sustainability manager. Nobody has to worry about sustainability because we've got that one person who does it for us. Same might be true of diversity or health and safety, etc., etc. But in reality, the kind of problems we're trying to address now are big enough that you can't really put them in a pigeonhole them against a single role. And part of realizing better outcomes from the built environment is actually thinking about how we do that, reflecting on our experience today and creating space so that we can identify better ways of working. I'm not suggesting everyone needs to sit down and write a book, but I don't know about you, but I often felt like thought leadership was something that other people did, and I should just get on with my day-to-day work. And I think that's a difficult, problematic way of viewing the world. So I'm trying to discourage that at the moment. The context, though, is that the world is changing and the world is becoming more intangible, at least from a value point of view. The over 80% of the value of the stock markets are associated with intangible assets at this point, and that's a huge change from 20, 30 years ago. Intangible assets have their benefits. They don't really emit a lot of carbon, but whilst the things we value has changed massively over this time period, the things that human beings actually need haven't actually changed that much. Intangible assets, for the most part, don't really provide us with shelter or transport, heating, power, connectivity, sanitation, healthcare, any of the things that we rely on for our day-to-day well-being. And so, as data professionals in this field, we often find ourselves taking solutions that have been designed for intangible organizations and trying to find how to apply them to the tangible world, because that's where we actually enact change in the built environment. Part of this is just getting the size of the problem right. I use these slides at work because I think it's a nice example of a broader paradigm, right? I'm always fond of build bridge inspections. It's how it's the first kind of data I got to play with early in my career. And you can see here on this diagram kind of the three different extremes of how you might go about doing that. On the one hand, there's the traditional approach that still happens to this day of just printing out the inspection report you did 5, 10, 20 years ago and red penning it on site. On the other side, there would be those that would want us to do everything in augmented reality or virtual reality and wander around the world with goggles on, pointing at things that aren't actually there. And in reality, the right mix for most customers to this day is some sort of mix of digital and non-digital. The image in the middle, you've got one fella making notes in paper and another person tapping it up on a tablet. perhaps because there's two different systems. And that's kind of where many built environment clients find themselves, is kind of standing it with a foot in both camps. That takes us nicely on to the diagnoses. So I didn't come up with a meta-narrative, but I've come up with a bunch of diagnoses. None of these diagnoses are unique to the built environment, but I think put them all together and you've got something that's pretty idiosyncratic and explains why working in digital and data in this space is so challenging. First thing to remember is the built environment exists to meet society's needs. So there's an ethical and moral argument here. Using data isn't a neutral act in that context. It's something that should help benefit society. And part of that is the disproportionate carbon impact that the built environment has, and which goes under acknowledged. You ask a man on the street, like, what are the big environmental issues? You might hear flights or car emissions or plastic straws. And while all of those are important, the built environment has probably a bigger impact than all of those, particularly travel and or flights and plastic straws. Cement alone is accountable for 7 to 8% of all global emissions. That those sort of facts are underappreciated, as I say, and therefore perhaps we get an easier ride than we ought to. And perhaps they're underappreciated in part because the data isn't there. There isn't enough data to keep score and make sure that we're not needlessly wasting resources. To work in the built environment is to reckon with complexity, and complexity in that context, I mean the Cynefin definition. So it's not complicated, it's complex, and it's complex because it involves human actors and chaos. It's not just a game that follows a certain set of rules. It's not chess where there's always an optimum move. It's poker where you don't know if your opponent's bluffing. And the human element in the built environment is huge, in part because of our history. As I say here, we've got tribes and specialisms that have evolved 200 years ago. And those professions are massively valuable, but they haven't always kept up with the challenges of the day, and they don't always think about things in data terms. They've optimized in their own domains, engineering, architecture, quantity surveying, what have you. They haven't necessarily optimized across the domains. And I think that's a big opportunity for data within this context, is to create solutions that work across multiple domains, to create shared meaning. Part of the challenge in that is that there's a unique data fingerprint for the built environment. Many of the technologies that get the most attention these days run almost entirely on structured data. Built environment, we have a whole bunch of other types of data that you need to make use of too. Your 3D models and your LiDAR and your point clouds and your drawings and your sketches and bits of paper that are hidden in archives, from hundreds of years ago. And we might not have as much data as other industries, but the breadth of data is much bigger, and therefore providing our users with access to all those different types of data is more of a challenge. And finally, on this slide at least, another slide, we are always sat between the digital and physical domains, and that's important to remember. And often there's a human being between our digital solutions and action in the real world. There's very few instances of digital insights directly changing how the built environment works, except maybe SCADA and IoT and that sort of thing. Most of the time, you're reliant on some sort of human expert applying the information they've gained from the digital world to make a difference in the physical world. A few more diagnoses. We haven't created a culture of data ownership. There's not enough roles in our organizations where people say, yes, I am responsible for this type of data. That is part of my work. Data is seen as, in many cases, someone else's problem. And the issue with that is to realize a lot of the big visions that we have, the exciting stuff that everyone gets worked up about, digital twins being a good example. We can't just buy fancy software and deploy fancy solutions. We have to sort out the underlying data issues that sit behind those solutions. So there's a bit of a discipline in doing your information management, your data quality, because if you don't get those things sorted out, digital twins aren't going to give you any value. The next 2 points kind of relate to the human experience of that data. Again, there's always almost always a human in the loop here. So if you can't make the data accessible through user-centered design and meaningful user interfaces, or if they don't want to because the data is presented in a manner that doesn't make sense to them or isn't aesthetically pleasing, or which because it's not aesthetically pleasing, they can't interpret, doesn't really matter how much clever stuff you've done in the background because it's not going to get utilized. And that kind of ties into the idea of friction, and friction matters here. There's inevitably friction between the digital world and the physical world. The more we can minimize that friction, the more impact we're likely to have. Similarly, there's friction between our human minds and the digital world that we derive information from. And that ties into the importance of tacit knowledge and heuristics, which, like it or not, is how most of us make decisions most of the time. And it's only by influencing that tacit knowledge and that heuristics that we can actually impact the decisions that people are making. Get onto that a bit more later. Too often in this life, the smartest data people aren't working on the most important challenges. So much of our effort has been channeled into consumerism and distracting people with entertainment and social media and sowing doubt into society. And that's part of what makes the opportunity here so important. As this quote, I always come back to this quote, the purpose of a system is what it does. It doesn't matter your intentions in terms of how you implement data. What matters is your outcomes. If you create an amazing social media site and it's turned into a cesspool of terrible ideas, and that's the outcome. That was the purpose of your system. It's evidenced by those outcomes, even if you didn't realize it. So we have the opportunity, because we're tied into social outcomes, to move from insipid and insidious use of data to nurturing and regenerative use of data, to one where we're building an environment for human beings rather than using human beings as that raw material. And when we think about new and exciting technologies like generative AI, we should be looking at it through that context. There is I was going to say a long history of AI. There isn't really a long history of AI, but the history of AI is riddled with AI reflecting our own biases. So on the one hand, you have this massive opportunity of a technology that can synthesize far more information than any one person could in their entire life. And on the other hand, so often those syntheses of information reflect our own worst inclinations. So when we think about how do we take these consumer type technologies like generative AI and apply them to our industry, we have to think about how do we get all the value of that information processing capability without being led down this biased route. How do we create a safe pair of hands that can make decisions more quickly than we can on our own without some invisible influence of the worst inclinations of the training data that has been trained on? I think that's an important challenge. I think there's a massive opportunity there if we can create generative AI that help us run the built environment that are genuinely, provably ethical, or at least ethically neutral, if not ethically positive. Why do I think there's such a big opportunity there? I think particularly in that space because it can help speed up the knowledge creation process. This is, I talked about tacit knowledge earlier. Here's a cycle where tacit knowledge, which exists in our heads, is externalized in the form of filling out forms and typing into computers, and creates explicit knowledge, which is then synthesized into charts and graphs that we then try and internalize back into our head. This is a process that today is riddled with friction. People don't want to spend their time typing into computers, and they don't want to spend their time looking at graphs. So it's much easier just to purely follow your heuristics. Now that we've got large language models, we can reduce the friction by using natural language conversation as a way of externalizing information out of our heads, including it in a neural network that already incorporates hundreds of years worth of human knowledge in this space, the entire corpus, if you will, and then re-internalize that back into our heads and the heads of our colleagues, again, through natural language conversation. It's a much more human-friendly way of creating knowledge, and it's one that could allow people like you and me to benefit much more from the huge, almost unknowably huge set of information on the built environment that exists, but is so rarely utilized. And this is how we will get to data-enabled sustainability. We're going to reduce friction by simplifying knowledge creation using AI. We can introduce ethics and equity by using data and AI to help us identify ways to deploy resources equitably. And ultimately, we can create flourishing systems, as the CDBB spoke about, by really evaluating if the decisions we're making are actually creating meaningful improvements to people's lives or merely generating noise. And that kind of takes me to one of the last biases that I wanted to talk about, which is our bias towards building. And that's everywhere in this industry. You know, the way you make money is you win work. You win work by doing things, right? If you win a project to build something, you're gonna get promoted, right? You're gonna get the ego boost of having built something. You're gonna be able to put it on LinkedIn. If you don't build something, you don't get any of those plaudits. There's nothing to put on your CV. But on the plus side, you haven't released any carbon, and perhaps you've made better use of the existing infrastructure that was there in the first place. There's always an opportunity cost, both in terms of money and carbon, in our industry, and we don't always really evaluate it in a kind of quantitative way. It's too easy to get excited about creating the new thing. With this in mind, I came up with the idea of the didn'ties, which would be awards that celebrate people not doing things as much as people doing things. Good examples are, creating new roads. I worked for National Highways. I'm not against roads per se, but I also know that induced demand exists, right? It's a thing. You build lots of roads, more cars come out, the roads are just as busy as when you started. So, a good example is don't just build new roads, think about the actual transport outcomes that you're looking to realize. Same is true of urban development. There's a lot of vanity projects out there that will perhaps be sustainable in the long run, but they nonetheless come with a massive embedded carbon price tag up front. Often they're greenwashed, so you don't think about that embedded carbon because all you're thinking about is the windmills and the solar panels that will exist in 20 years' time. But that doesn't make that embedded carbon not exist. It's still there. You're just distracted. But we already have plenty of cities, and we already have plenty of cities that are begging for retrofitting so that those existing cities can work more efficiently and sustainably. So some good examples of this, projects that didn't happen. The Welsh Roads Review basically put all new road building projects on indefinite hiatus. And I think that's a major statement in the sense of not saying we'll never build roads again, but saying the default is we don't build roads. The default is we find other ways of doing things. The Vjosa project in Albania was one that someone suggested on LinkedIn, and I looked into it, and it's great. Like, yeah, we could build a hydroelectric dam, but we could also just have a national park that celebrates our natural resources. Even Keystone in America is an example of, albeit a bit belatedly, realizing that the decisions we're making aren't actually leading to the outcomes that we say we are looking for. And the same is true in terms of more down-to-earth adaptive uses, making better use of old infrastructure such as the High Line in New York, repurposing historic buildings that are frankly much more beautiful than whatever they would have been replaced with, such as Granary Square right here in London, and the ever controversial low traffic neighborhoods, which that's a whole other presentation to get into that. But again, it's moving away from the default mode being cars and roads towards something that's a little bit more, in theory, information defensible based on our stated objectives. So let's just bring it back to data. What's this all got to do with data? Well, data isn't just it isn't just a byproduct of the built environment. It's part of the solution to how we adapt our built environment, how we reuse our resources, how we reduce demand or direct demand into more structured ways, or better outcomes. We're not just virtue signaling when we're using data. It needs to be aesthetically appealing, but it's actually trying to keep score, trying to create a baseline of metrics that allow us to set a course for the future and actually measure our progress to that. If we can live up to those goals, then data will be a force for good in this industry. If we don't, it will just be an expensive distraction. And if you want to talk to me more about that, here I am. Here are my details. Thanks for watching. I appreciate it.